Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Just going to give it a minute or two to let the online room fill up as people join us this morning. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat if you would like to. Okay, let's get started. Good morning. Welcome to the final day of Friends for Life 2021. Thank you ever so much for joining us again and for all of your support over the weekend. We've got some really good sessions again today and a whole variety of them. And this one is one of those where I kind of really hope that we'll all leave with some concrete, practical things which can help our families and our children. Really pleased to introduce John Pemberton. There's a few things that you need to know about John before I hand over to him. He himself lives with type 1, and so he speaks, from kind of deep personal experience. Is a diabetes educator who runs a number of clinics at Birmingham Children's Hospital, some for those newly diagnosed, some for those making a move to new technologies, and also for people that are particularly interested in sport, because John himself is a very high-level cricket player in particular. So the last thing you need to know about John, though, is he's a great friend of Friends for Life. Over the last number of years, he's given up an enormous amount of time to give many different talks, not just to us, but to our children as well, always with great feedback as to how engaging and practically useful they are. So please do put your questions for John in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll make sure we have time for those at the end. But John, thanks ever so much for joining us again, and over to you.
Perfect, thank you. Just going to share my screen, so hopefully you're going to be able to see this. Chris, can you just give us a thumbs up? You can see that? Great, perfect. So good morning, everyone. Obviously, I can't see you, but you can see me. It would be lovely if we were face to face, but obviously that's not possible this year. So hopefully this session is going to give you a lot of practical insight of things you can do if you want to manage your diabetes as proactively as possible to get as much time in range as you would desire. So the Glucose Never Lies, basically came about in April of this year, where all the knowledge that I've acquired over 12 years of having diabetes and working within diabetes, I asked myself the question, if Grace or Jude, my two kids who you can see here, were to get type 1, how would I try to manage it? How would I try to educate my wife, Danny? How would I try to educate my mum and dad, their grandma and granddad? So we're all on the same page, so we could have a joint understanding, but also understand what is possible in terms of management of diabetes. So I put this together in a website called The Glucose Never Lies. There's no money involved in it or anything like that. It is literally just me putting out how I would manage diabetes for my kids and how I manage diabetes myself. So it's quite a selfish presentation in some ways, but hopefully you will be able to glean some things from this as you move along. Now, granted, none of you are probably as much of a psycho as I am with my diabetes control. So there are going to be some things in here that you think, that's ridiculous. I would never think about doing that. And that is absolutely fine. I wouldn't want you to do. But what I would hope you're open to is having a look at some of the suggestions and thoughts and thinking, what bits of this could I take away that would improve my personal diabetes, or that I would be able to use with my young person with diabetes to facilitate some better diabetes control, but also to gain that sense of control. So we're going to work through that, and then hopefully if you've got some questions at the end, please fire in. But before we start, please don't think you have to do everything that's on here. This is kind of the absolute micromanaging level of diabetes that I'm going to present, but you don't have to do all of that. There might just be elements within here that you think are useful for you to take forward. First of all, it's probably important to say this stuff I'm going to be discussing is best used with continuous glucose monitoring, but it's important to just understand what continuous glucose monitoring is. Obviously, we know when we do a finger prick, it punches the skin, blood comes up to the surface with glucose on it, you're measuring the glucose that's in the blood. With a CGM, I personally use a Dexcom, could be a Libre, could be a Medtronic, could be a Medtrum, could be an Eversense, could be loads of different things. You're measuring, the sensor is measuring the glucose in your fat tissue. So the readings are about 5 minutes what's gone behind what's happening in the blood. So the two readings never match, but this devices now, especially the Libre 2 and the Dexcom G6, have a standard of approval of accuracy that are definitely good enough to replace finger pricks 95% of the time. But obviously the value of these devices are they offer trend arrows, which is the big game changer. Well, that's to say, when you move from finger pricks like I did, doing probably 10 or 12 finger pricks a day, it meant that I had 10 or 12 decisions to make in a day. But now I've got my Dexcom, and your kids have got these Dexcom and things, you've got a decision to make every sort of 5 minutes if you wanted to have a look that often. So I'm 6.4 and trending down now. Now I've got to talk for the next half an hour, 40 minutes. So just to be on the safe side, I'm going to bang a couple of glucose tablets down, because I'd rather not go hypo in the next sort of 15, 20 minutes when I'm talking to you. So that's the type of thing I'm talking about. If you just had a 6.4 with no arrow, you wouldn't be making that decision. So these trend arrows allow you to offer different decisions and different thought-making processes for trying to keep the glucose level in range. Important to know what the arrows mean. So try to put the different devices and what they mean practically. If anyone tries and tells you that a trend arrow will tell you where the glucose is going to be in 30 minutes time, they don't know what they're talking about. It's only going to tell you what's happening in 10 minutes, because you will have seen with these trend arrows, they change every 10 minutes or so. So for example, if I had a glucose level of 6.4 with a double arrow going down, suggesting I'm going to be 2 lower in 10 minutes time, hence I'm going to be 4.4 in 10 minutes time. That's why I've taken a couple of glucose tabs. But if I tried to suggest that would tell me what's happening in 30 minutes time, that would mean my level would be 0.4 in the next 30 minutes, which obviously is not possible. So please don't try and think 30 minutes in the future, just try and think 10 or 15 minutes in the future, because that's what the trend arrows are really telling you. So pretty simply, if it's moving very fast, it's going to be 2 up or 2 lower in the next 10 minutes. If it's only moving slightly up and down, it's only going to be 1 higher or 1 lower in the next 10 minutes time. It will give you a better decision-making process if you think in 10 minutes rather than 30. Here's some ideas. So the new sort of measure that you'll get when you go to clinic is time in range. The percentage of time your CGM or glucose values have been between 4 and 10 in a day. So obviously I tried to put a traffic light system to make it really easy for you to understand or think about here. So obviously the more green it is, the more energy you will have, because the more the glucose has been in target, and the better the health in the future. The more orange and red it is, the less energy you will have on a daily basis, and the more chance there will be problems with diabetes in the future. So you can use this thinking about what % time in range you would like based on how much energy you would like and how much protection of health you would like in the future. But really important to understand that as you want more percentage time in range, you will have to bring down your high alert on your CGM. Now, anyone who's got a CGM with an alarm will know that this high alarm is really annoying. So you have to be careful with where you start. I would suggest start it at 14 and then bring it down slowly once you find out what's working for you, so you don't have this CGM going off every 2 minutes or so and getting annoying and you don't do anything. You need to set the high alert at a level where you're prepared to take action with either extra insulin or, as we're going to discuss in a minute, short bursts of exercise to bring it down. If you set your high alert at 10 and it goes off and you do nothing about it, it's a total waste of time. So you need to have the high alert set at a level where you're ready and prepared to take action to bring that down. For me, with the kids that I teach, we always start at 14 and then we bring it down slowly depending on what seems relevant and suitable for that family and young people. Okay, let's go to the next one. So this is where this kind of what I call dynamic glucose management really started for me properly. So Christmas Day 2018 was one of my most frustrating days with diabetes that I've ever had. So this is what it looks like. This is a CGM trace over the 24 hours. You can see I was rising above target. I had my high alert set at 10, so that woke me up. Obviously, I was getting a bit excited because Santa was coming. So I gave myself 1 correction dose here. It hadn't come down in a couple of hours, so I gave myself another correction dose, and eventually it came down. Reasonable start, just a small lunch, up and down as usual, and then Christmas Day started. Turkey, trimmings, Christmas pudding, custard, cheese and biscuits, couple of beers, basically everything you can imagine. Gave myself the insulin for the carbohydrate that I wanted to cover. But then, as you can see, the glucose started off on its climb up Everest, and then it required 1 correction, 2 correction, 3 correction, 4 correction, and eventually a whacking 5-dose correction, which obviously I clearly overdid it at that point. And then it came flying down. And because there was Coca-Cola knocking about, I smashed back 3 Cokes and then off the other way. So obviously I spent a lot of time high here, which really annoys me, because if you all know me, I don't like being high, so it was really frustrating. And then obviously once I started to come down where I wanted to be, I'd totally overdone it with the corrections and gone really high. So you might be asking a couple of questions here, as I was after Christmas Day 2018, is if I've given a correction dose here, here, and here, why is it taking 2, 3, 4 hours before this glucose level is coming down? And the answer is because fast-acting insulin, although it's fast-acting, takes 2 hours to peak and 4 hours to finish. So when you give a correction dose, it's realistically going to take 3 hours for that correction dose to bring you back down to target, which in diabetes time is a long time. And when you treat hypos with sugar rather than glucose, it takes 20-25 minutes to kick in, but is not fully absorbed for, say, 40 minutes. So often, if you're checking every 15-20 minutes, you end up double and triple treating unnecessarily. So basically, that was Christmas Day 2018. Really didn't enjoy that day, and it spoiled a day which should have been a good day for me. So that really made me think differently about how can I change my approach when I'm high in between meals to thinking about something different to corrections. And now what am I going to do about treating my hypos or preventing hypos? Are there better options than what I'm currently doing? And this is probably the most important slide of the talk, I feel. So just want you to really take time to absorb this. So if you're high in between meals, such as here, the high alarm goes off, the glucose level is rising. You administer a correction dose, which takes 1.5 to 2 hours to peak, 3 to 4 hours to finish. So the correction dose works nicely, but you stay above target for about 2.5 hours. And that is the best that fast-acting insulin corrections can do, because that's how insulin works. But if you're active and you do exercise for 10 or 15 minutes, you can see the impact on it lowering the glucose level is much faster. You're talking about 15, 20, 25 minutes for that to work. So let's call it at the worst, half an hour for it to work versus 3 hours. You're talking about something that works 6 times faster than fast-acting insulin. Now, if the pharmaceutical companies had a drug that works 6 times faster than fast-acting insulin, they would be billionaires. But the difference is you've got to do something to achieve this, which is you've got to move your backside, which requires human motivation, which is a little bit more difficult than just giving another correction dose. So I'm not saying that this is easy to do, but I'm saying it's the most effective method for bringing a high glucose level down. So hopefully you understand that, and we're going to kick into how that works shortly. Next is, let's think about fast and slow movers of pushing the glucose up. So we know insulin is a slow mover of bringing the glucose level down, and exercise is a faster mover of bringing the glucose level down. Well, sugar-based treatments are a slow mover of the glucose up because they take 20 to 30 minutes to kick in and take up to 40 minutes for the Coke, for example, to be fully absorbed, which means that you often go low and it takes a while to treat. Dextrose, on the other hand, which is pure glucose, gets in the system much quicker in 10 to 15 minutes and should treat the hypo or prevent the hypo much faster. So therefore, hopefully you won't go low, and you certainly shouldn't need double or triple treatments. Fast forward to the exact same day in 2019, a year on, trying some different strategies. So here we go, over the night, start to go high again, requiring 2 corrections. Obviously, I'm still at the age of 40 or 35 at the time. Get excited when Santa's coming. Now, quite clearly, I'm not going to get out of bed and start doing exercise to bring the high level down during the night. Not even I'm crazy enough to do that. So I would do the corrections where it's sensible. But here after lunch, I'd gone high. I'd done what I call high knees, which is just literally jogging on the spot like this for 10 minutes. And that brought the glucose level down quick, sharp. But this is where the real magic happened here. So I was on the way down, had a little dextrose tablets here, prevented myself going low. And then at virtually the same Christmas dinner as before. But this time when I started to go high, I put in some high knees here. And then it required 3 lots of high knees to bring the glucose level down without any extra insulin. The previous year, this required about 10 units of extra insulin. So you can think of this level of activity as equal to 10 units of insulin. Now, I'm not suggesting anybody in their right mind would do 30 to 40 minutes of high knees or exercise or jogging on the spot every day to manage the diabetes. But I'm also suggesting that no one would eat Christmas dinner every day, which involved turkey, trimmings, Christmas pudding, cheese and cake and beers, for example. So this is an extreme example, but it just shows you the impacts of using activity to drop highs between meals instead of using extra correction insulin. There's a lot more time in range, a lot less insulin required, and then you can get off the glucose roller coaster much faster. So this kind of comes into what I call dynamic glucose management, what we teach to our children and young people at Birmingham on our CGM programs, and we slip it into 3 categories: strategies to stop highs, GAIN, which we'll go through; strategies to stay in target, called SET, which again we'll go through; and then strategies to prevent lows, which we call MATCH, which we'll go through. This is just me not trying to show off, but just trying to show you someone who practices all of these strategies to the letter as an adult who's got nothing else to do with their life apart from managing the diabetes, can achieve 99% time in range and 80% time in the range of normal glucose levels for people without diabetes. Now, I would not expect or want anybody else to go to those lengths that I do, but this is just to show I walk the talk, I do what I'm talking about. So obviously you can pick and choose the things that will work for you, but that's kind of what's possible. So this is the first thing. How do we stop highs between meals if we're not always going to use correction doses? So before I start this, I will still do correction doses and suggest for the people who I work with to do correction doses overnight. I would not expect anyone to do exercise overnight to bring the high levels down. If they're at school or they're at somewhere where they can't do it, obviously and quite clearly do correction doses. Don't do exercise also. And if you can't be asked, if you're tired and you don't want to do it, then obviously give a correction dose. This is to be used as and when you feel would be useful and appropriate and wouldn't make you stand out like a sore thumb if that's what you're also worried about. Saying that, we're happy to do this in the toilets at work to bring high glucose levels down, but that's just me. So the first thing is what we've already discussed is decide how much time in range you would like, and then set your high alert according to that. Now, don't start too aggressively. If you want 60% time in range, set it at 14. If you want to try and aim for 70%, set it at 12, 75, 11, and 80 at 10, all the way down to setting as low as 8. I previously had my high level set at 8, which was too low because it kept going off and it was annoying. I now have it set at about 9 or 9.5, and that's when I decide to take action. As I said before, you've got to set the high alert at where you're prepared to take action. So start high and bring it down as you feel appropriate. The next thing you'll need is a type of exercise or activity that you can do anywhere. Things that I do is jogging on the spot, going for a walk, doing some jumping jacks. I've got a rowing machine in the garage. I'll do something like that. Some of the kids that we work with, some of them just go for a walk around the back garden and do laps. Some of them go up and down the stairs. Some of them jog on a spot. Some of them go and play football with their friends. Some of them get the Nintendo Wii on. Some of them do Just Dance. There's loads of different things you can do to be creative to get the body moving. So once the high alert goes off, decide what activity you're going to do. And then depending on what the glucose level is and where your trend arrow is, will tell you how much minutes of activity roughly you will require to do to bring the glucose level back down. So if my glucose level was, let's say, 11 with an arrow straight across, that would require 15 minutes of jogging on the spot for me to get it back between 4 and 7. As I said, I have mine set about 9.5, so usually I'm doing between 5 and 10 minutes of activity to bring it down. Some of the other kids I work with are often, say, between 10 and 14 usually when they do this, and it's usually an hour across. They're looking at 20 minutes of activity usually in those instances to bring it back down. So you might be thinking, well, how does activity bring glucose levels down so quickly in comparison to quick-acting insulin? Well, there are 2 reasons why. Here's the first reason. So you think of insulin as being a key to opening the front door to your muscle cells to allow glucose to travel in from the blood. Exercise opens a side door that doesn't require insulin. So it allows a lot more glucose to leave the bloodstream without the need for extra insulin. So that's the first reason. The second and probably most important reason is when you're active, the blood starts pumping around your body to your muscles, which means that the insulin is delivered a lot faster to those muscles. Therefore, the insulin works quicker and drags the glucose out of the blood faster. So it almost supercharges the insulin that's within your system. Hence the Popeye, exercise makes insulin stronger and also lasts longer. If you're sat on your backside, for example, the blood flow to your muscles is slower, therefore the insulin action is much slower. Now, the minutes that are suggested on here are a suggestion. They will not work perfectly for you every time. They are just a guideline for you to start safely somewhere and then work out what works for you. And the whole title of this talk is called The Glucose Never Lies, which basically means when you try a strategy, if your glucose level stays in target afterwards or goes where you want to, that means that that strategy works. If you go low, that strategy did not work. If you go high, that strategy did not work. It requires a little bit of adjustment. So this is where you should use your continuous glucose monitor as the bit of feedback that tells you whether strategies work or they don't work. Now, a lot of healthcare professionals, I can say this because I work in the industry, will tell you, this is the rule, this is what you've got to follow, and you've got to follow it exactly to the letter. And if you don't, I'm going to come back and tell you off. Not quite as drastic as that, but not too far off. But what you have to understand is the strategies and theories that you're taught are a starting point, just like this. What will tell you whether they work for you or not is the effect on the glucose level. And that's your job to find out what works for you and work out your own diabetes rules. So that's a bit of a disclaimer from me to say, this is somewhere to start, but you'll need to sort of work out what works for you if you decide that you want to go through this. Okay, so that's game. So if you go high between meals, you can use activity. You've now got another tool where you can use activity instead of a correction dose to bring the glucose level down. And as a side note, there's a big benefit of using activity instead of correction doses in that it keeps your daily insulin dose under control. And I know from a lot of the research looking at in the future, the people who are on lower insulin doses for how much they weigh are the ones who have better weight in the future, how much they weigh, and also a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease in the future. So there's a lot of good reasons. More time in range, less cardiovascular risk in the future for using activity and exercise. And bear in mind, children and young people are meant to do 60 minutes of activity in a day anyway, so you can just use 1 or 2 of these on the day to count towards that 60 minutes. So we're not asking people to do any more than they should be doing for a healthy human being, just strategically using it to manage your diabetes as well. So that's game. That's preventing stopping highs. Staying in target is just a simple strategy of, I'm sure you've been taught by your diabetes teams, give your insulin 15 to 20 minutes before eating. And that is very sound and very effective advice. But is that still the right advice if your glucose level is 13.5 and trending up? Would you not be better off giving the insulin a little bit earlier so it can start to come down before it goes back up again? So this is what SET is. It means start your insulin before eating based on your glucose value and trend arrow. So as an example, if the glucose level was 11 before eating, especially breakfast, and you were maybe even trending up, you can get away with giving the insulin 35 minutes before. So it's got a chance to come from that 11.5 down a little bit before your shreddies start kicking in. If you only give it 15 minutes before, you're going to go 13.5, 16, 17, 18, and eventually down. You're going to spend a lot more time above range. So there's a guide there for what the glucose level is, what the trend arrow is, and a suggestion of starting minutes. And as again, it will not work perfectly for you 100% all of the time. It's a starting guide for you to develop and see if the glucose never lies for you afterwards. People may be saying, and quite rightly, well, why am I going to be testing my glucose level? And then I've got to wait 40 minutes before I eat. Well, if you just think sensibly and take it back a strategy and just go, well, instead of just looking at my glucose level 15 minutes before eating, I'll now start looking at it 30 minutes before eating, and it'll give me more time to do the adjustments that I need. And again, you would only do this if it's practically possible within your lifestyle. If this sounds like a crazy idea, then bin it off. You don't need to do it. The second thing is obviously the more balanced your meals are, the more effectively insulin matches those. So the green here represents glucose going into the blood from a balanced meal. And on the bottom in the blue is how insulin works over that 4 hours. You will see that these two match quite nicely. And what we're also promoting and finding very effective is that 10 or 15 minutes of activity after eating, again, supercharges that insulin so it works a bit faster, so you actually get a flatter profile. Now, as parents, you can use this sensibly and kind of go, oh, what could I get my little Johnny to do after the evening meal? Maybe he could help me washing the dishes or putting out the washing on the line instead of sitting on his backside watching Peppa Pig. That type of thing will have a big impact on how clean your house is, but also the glucose levels after eating. And I can tell you from lots of experience with working with young people, the kids who walk to school have much lower glucose levels after eating compared to the kids who get a lift to school. So they're just some simple examples. Match, which is basically what I've just shown you. It's how do you prevent lows in an effective and safe way. So the first thing with match is M. You need to give a specific amount of or calculate your hypo treatment based on how heavy you are. So as the kilos go up, the amount of glucose goes up, the amount of dextrose tablets goes up. I quite clearly weigh over 60 kilos. So you cap it at 60 kilos because if you have any more than 18 grams of fast-acting glucose, it won't get absorbed in the 20 minutes. Therefore, if you stick 10 glucose tablets in, when you go to retest in 15 to 20 minutes time, you'll still have 10 of those grams sat in your belly. So I just did this before, and we'll use myself as an example because it's now about 10 minutes on. I weigh 60 kilos, 18 grams of carbs, 6 dextrose tablets will be my full treatment. Second thing is always use glucose only, never sugar, okay? And this is why. So you'll see when you have a sugar treatment, like a Haribo, a Coca-Cola, a Starburst, a Skittles, anything that's a candy-based thing is half glucose, half fructose. When you eat that, it goes in, gets digested. The fructose goes from your small intestine into your liver and gets stuck in your liver. Only the glucose goes out. So only half of that sugar that you've eaten is available to treat the hypo, which often means that the glucose level hasn't come up in 15 to 20 minutes. So you often need a second treatment and then it goes really high. And then also you've got a lot more fructose backing up in the liver, which can actually cause you to overeat. So basically treating with sugar, you're more likely to need double treatments and you're more likely to overeat. If you use glucose only, such as glucose tabs, Lucozade, Lucozade Sport, Glucojuice, Lift, all those things, you can see when you take that, it's all glucose, it all goes into the intestine and it all goes through the liver and treats the hypo quickly. Therefore, you've got more chance of it treating the hypo more effectively and faster. Now, I know with working with a lot of young people, they hate glucose tablets, they hate Lucozade, they hate Lift, etc. So I'm not saying you have to do this, but I'm saying if you can do this, it will be preferential to treat with glucose only as opposed to sugar for this very reason. Now, the amount of glucose that you give shouldn't always be the same. I shouldn't require the same 6 glucose tablets for a level of 5.5 that's just trending down versus 5.5 with a double arrow down. That obviously makes clear sense, but it's something that we don't get taught. So this table just allows you to have a look at this and see what you could give. So if you're preventing hypos between 4 and 6, depending on what your trend arrow is, you should either give 100, 75 or 50% of the treatment. So I think I was probably about 6.4, so that it's slightly higher, just trending down, therefore 50% of my hypo treatment would be needed, which is 3 dextrose tablets, which is what I ate. We've now got a nice steady level of 6 rather than it going down and treating a hypo. If I would have given the full 6 glucose tablets, that would now be 7.89 trending on its way up. So it's microdosing the carbs rather than giving the full carbs. Obviously, if you're less than 4, then the amounts that you'll require of your percentage of your hypo treatment will be more when it's trending down fast and less when it's going here. So something that may happen to you, which is quite common, the glucose level is 3.9, it's just trending steady across, you give the full hypo treatment, you shoot really high. You probably only needed half of your usual treatment. So that's the reason why you should adapt your hypo treatment based on here. And then the final thing is H, which is have patience, which is really difficult because as we've said on a CGM, it's about 5 minutes behind what's happening in the glucose. And we know that it takes, each gram of glucose gets absorbed in a minute. So if you've had 15 to 18 grams of glucose, it's going to take at least 15 minutes to be in the blood and then another 5 minutes to show on your continuous glucose monitor. So you really need to wait 20 minutes before you give that second treatment. Otherwise, you're at the risk of double treating. Now, I know how hard that is because when you're low and you're feeling hungry and you're feeling shaky, all you want to do is eat as much as you possibly can. But then when you do that, you know what happens. You go flying up the other way and then you start giving correction doses and then starts the glucose roller coaster. So you have to be really patient and try and wait 20 minutes. I'm pretty good at waiting 20 minutes during the day. I'm terrible at waiting 20 minutes during the night because all I want to do is make sure the hypo's sorted and get back to sleep. So I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying try and have patience. So what you can download from the site, if you think this would be useful for you, is everything I've just discussed in game, set and match on one little PDF, which again, this is what I use all the time, hence having a lot of time in range. You wouldn't have to do this all the time. The kids that I work with don't do this all the time. Probably half of them use this exercise to bring highs down a bit at the time. 25% of them use it a lot. The other 50% of them think it's ridiculous and won't even touch it. In terms of bolusing before meals, a lot of the families do this in the evening and breakfast, but obviously at school, they've got no chance to do it. And a lot of them, again, now we teach this at school and it's becoming more effective. So we're not having these really bouncing going highs after hypo treatments. So we're moving forward in terms of our management, but remembering that everything that you do here takes an investment of time and energy and brain power from yourselves. So if you're someone who has already got diabetes burnout, don't think these strategies are ridiculous, please don't do them. Just carry on with what you're doing. Obviously, the future automatic pancreas systems will take a lot of the burden away from diabetes, which is great, certainly in terms of not needing to do set and match probably as much. But one thing with these automatic pancreas systems is they're amazing overnight. They'll get you 95% time in range. But during the day, when you don't give your insulin before eating, you will still go high after eating, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen. This strategy will still be beneficial, definitely moving forward. This is just an example of a young lady who I work with, who might be someone like you. The reds here are correction doses. So she will correct, come flying down, treat with sugar, not come up and then fly the other way. Spending most days on the glucose roller coaster with multiple corrections and lots of hypo treatments. She changed to using the 5 to 10 minutes of activity on the high alert here, didn't stop the being high, didn't have as many crashes, and started to use glucose only as hypo prevention treatments. So this is the same girl using the same normal daily life, but using activity as a preference. Obviously, she still used correction doses overnight, but that's the difference you can achieve, a lot more control, but it does mean you're going to have to do an extra 5 to 15 minutes of activity in a day. But as I said, if you're meant to be doing 60 minutes anyway, you can just use it within that. Does it work? So we've looked at the first 50 people that we teach, and the bottom graphic is probably the most important. So this is time in range across here. So this is 10% time in range, 30, 50, 70 is kind of where we're aiming for, and then 90. And this is dynamic glucose management score. How proactive are people using game, set and match? So as you can see, this, as the score goes up, the more proactive the people use it, the more time in range they have. And you can see here that probably about half of the people who use it frequently, they have at least 60% or above. The people who don't really use it, they have much lower time in range. So it just goes to show it actually works in practice. Whew. Okay, dynamic glucose management sorted, and I wanted to give you a quick whistle-stop tour around the mealtime insulin guide. So this is just a simple guide of trying to bring in how to manage high-carb meals that are low in fat, balanced meals, and high-fat meals with carbs. So I'm going to walk you through this, but you can have a look at this in greater detail on the site. So meals that are mostly carbs with low fat include most breakfast cereals, toasted ham or jam or honey, meals at lunchtime like jack potatoes and beans, and then cereal bars like snacks. Basically most carbs with very little fat and protein. And what you find here is, how the graph works is, the red is the glucose going in, for example, from this bowl of Cocoa Pops here. And then this is the CGM trace where it's 4 or 5, goes up to 14. Obviously, the insulin is given, but you can see here how the insulin works is much slower at bringing glucose out of the blood than the food going in. So you go high and then come down. So you can't increase the insulin dose because you would go low here. So you need to think about other things to prevent this post-meal spike. What are those things? Well, first of all, you might be thinking, well, why does this happen? I give my insulin at the correct time. Why do I still go high? What's going on? This diagram will hopefully help to explain. So as we said, when you eat carb foods, they get digested, go into the gut, go into something first called the portal vein, into the liver, and then out into the bloodstream. Now, people without diabetes have insulin that's released from their pancreas, which means that they detect the glucose level going high, the pancreas puts loads of insulin out, so most of the carbs for the meal is actually captured within the liver. But people with diabetes, type 1 diabetes, this doesn't work, so insulin is put in from the outside. So what happens is glucose doesn't get stored in the liver first, goes out into the bloodstream, and then it meets the insulin. So it's because people with type 1 diabetes have very low levels of insulin in the portal vein is the reasons why you still get spikes after eating, despite giving the insulin at the right time. So first thing you can do is what we've already discussed, is making sure that the insulin goes in before eating, depending on the glucose level and trend arrow, to give it a head start. But the second set of strategies are, you can try and make your carb foods more whole grain choices. I'm not quite how whole grain you can make Cocoa Pops, but you can certainly turn them into Shreddies or Weetabix, for example. You can use whole grain bread instead of white bread, for example, adding some vegetables in, and also maybe adding a bit of fat if possible. The other thing that is really effective, and this is where walking to school comes in, is doing 10 to 20 minutes of activity after having something like breakfast cereal, supercharges that insulin and keeps on top of it. So this would be like someone who walks to school. This would be their glucose profile afterwards. It'd probably go up to 10, then come back down. This is more like a profile for someone who sits in the car and goes to school after Cocoa Pops. So you can see the value of activity there. Okay, balanced meal. A balanced meal is something with a carb, a protein, and a vegetable generally. So you can see some ideas there, but you kind of know what a balanced meal is. And what that really does is it slows down how quickly the glucose is absorbed. Therefore, it matches the action of insulin much more effectively. And the glucose profile, again, is very in target. You still go up to 10 and come back down, but that is a really good place to be. If you wanted to make it even flatter, that's where you do things like you put 10 to 15 minutes of activity in after eating, and you will almost get a flat profile, especially if you have a balanced meal. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is, if you're meant to be doing 60 minutes of activity in a day, prioritizing 10 minutes of activity after each meal would make your diabetes management much more effective, and then keeping a little bit in reserve for those highs in between meals. Woo. Last one. Okay, so this is for the meals that are very high in fat with carbs, basically anything that tastes really good. So from breakfasts, full English breakfasts, pancakes with maple syrup, loads of cheese on toast, pizzas, takeaways, etc. So anything like this, I'm sure you will have seen a picture on your glucose profile that goes like this. You count the carbs, you give the insulin. The insulin works faster than the carbs can be absorbed because all the fat keeps that meal in your stomach. You go low, you treat the hypo, and then the rest of the carbs get through and you end up going really high. And there's also something else happening here from after 3 hours after eating these meals, which is when you have these high fat meals, which is called insulin resistance. Basically, your insulin does not work as effective 3 hours after eating up to 8 hours when you have one of these type of meals, because the high fat level stops the insulin working as effectively. So there's a few big challenges that we have to overcome here. For me, pizza has been my nemesis since having diabetes. With thinking you've managed it by the time you've gone to bed, and then you wake up in the night with your high alarm going off and your glucose is 16 and rising, and you're like, what is going on here? And you're trying to smash in correction doses. Have I done too much correction? And then you can't get to sleep. Basically, it's not a good place to be. So how can we manage that more effectively? First of all, just because I'm a curious mind, I like the word insulin resistance doesn't mean a great deal to me. I want to know what's actually happening at the cell level, why this high fat level is causing my insulin to not work so well. So I'm going to give you a whistle stop tour. If this goes over your head, don't worry, you don't need to know it. I'm just telling you because there will be a few curious minds within here. So what happens is when you have a high carb meal with loads of fat, the glucose is represented from the carbs in yellow, and the high fat is represented by these little green aliens. You eat them, they get digested and go into your gut, and then they go into that portal vein again, and they go into your liver, into your bloodstream. And what happens is the high fat level slows down how quickly the carbs get absorbed. That's why it gets absorbed much more slowly. But here's the key thing. After 3 hours, when a lot of this fat is going through our system, a lot of the fat goes into our liver cells and into our muscle cells. And what happens is when the high fat level in our muscle cells and liver cells happens, you get something called DAGs, diacylglycerols, that are made in our cells. And what you can see is when that happens is it blocks the insulin turning the key. So if you eat a high fat meal 3 hours after eating, this fat gets into your cells and stops insulin from working. So you're going to need a lot more insulin to overcome this, or there may be another strategy to consider. But when people say insulin resistance to you, and they probably don't know what's actually happening, you can tell them, oh, it's when you have a high fat meal and the fat travels into our liver cells and muscle cells, the fat gets turned into a diacylglycerol and it blocks insulin from binding and stops glucose being moved across. That's what insulin resistance is. So what can you do? This is what we teach to start. So what first thing you need to do is you need to increase the amount of insulin that you're going to give for the meal above what the carb suggests. A starting place to suggest is 25% extra. So as an example, if my pizza dose came to 10 units, I would need to give 12.5, not 10 units, because I would need to increase it by 25%. But I would not want to give that 12.5 all before eating. I would want to spread that out so that it try and covers the effect of this insulin resistance. So as a place to start would to be give half before eating and half a couple of hours after. So in that case, it would be 6.5 units before and the other 6 units about 2 hours after eating if you're on injections, or you could do an extended wave where you give 50% of the insulin up front on a pump and the other 50% over the next, say, 2 or 3 hours. Therefore, you would have a lot more insulin hanging around to manage the meal, and the extra insulin should manage some of this insulin resistance. A bit of exercise wouldn't go amiss also. Important to say, 25% is like the basement of how much you will need. Research on people with type 1 diabetes for a pizza suggests on average 65% extra insulin is required to cover the insulin resistance effect from a high fat pizza. So you would start with 25% extra. If it didn't work, next time you try 50%. If that didn't work, next time you try 75%. So you can go up in 25% increments of how much extra insulin to give. Again, the glucose never lies. Your CGM trace will tell you whether it works or not. An alternative strategy, if you're having a high-fat breakfast or a high-fat lunch, is to plan in some exercise 3 hours after eating, because exercise will make the insulin that's around work better, open side door to your cells that are not blocked, and also burn up some of this fat in your cells so you get rid of the insulin resistance effect. How it would look is something like this. I've done this before where I've gone out with my friends for a pizza. I've given the insulin for the pizza, which has managed the glucose levels nicely for the first 2 or 3 hours. And then I've put in some exercise for 45 minutes from 3 o'clock onwards, and therefore got a flat profile. Now, I'm not saying you should do this. This is just an alternative strategy for needing the extra. That is me done. You can get everything that you want from the glucoseneverlies.com. I appreciate that was fast and quick, but there's a lot to go through. And yeah, I just wanted, you can watch this back quite clearly. So I wanted to try and cover as much as I possibly could, and obviously leave you with the opportunity to go and get those resources.
Thank you, John. That was brilliant. Thank you. And certainly the feedback that's been coming through on the chat is people have found it really helpful, learned lots, new strategies with the high knees and pizzas and all sorts of things. We've got a couple. I've been picking up a couple of questions, some quite specific questions as we go through, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
One about with the short bursts of exercise when you start to go high, how to kind of calibrate that so you don't overdo it and then that just makes you go low later on.
So the beauty of having a continuous glucose monitor is not only will you can see what happens to the trend arrows. So when you see what happens to doing the glucose level afterwards, the trend arrows and what happens will tell you whether you've overdone it. But you've also got the protection of a low alarm. So if you have overdone it, you'll get a low alert and you'll need to then have some glucose tablets. But the most important thing is you've got to learn from experience. So you'll find that, 5 to 10 minutes for you might not be enough. You might need 15, 20, or you might just need 7 minutes, and different types of exercise will have different effects. So I would say it's a method of trial and error. If you've overdone it and you go low, you'll know next time you need to pull back on the minutes. But if you stay high or it hasn't worked, then you push the minutes, you stick a few more minutes on next time. So it requires a bit of titration from you. And it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think I just noticed on the side, our team suggests between 4 and 7. absolutely you want to get the glucose levels between 4 and 7, but in terms of looking at that timing range between 4 and 10 in terms of percentages, that's the bit where most people are looking at in terms of health protection in the future, especially bearing in mind now we've got continuous glucose monitors that are giving us results every 5 minutes. Definitely when it was only finger pricks, 4 to 7 is where you'd want to be the majority of the time, but it's just not quite that possible after eating all the time to be between 4 and 7.
Okay, thank you. That was one of the other questions I was going to pick up. The last one, someone was asking about, obviously they've got a child on one of the newer pumps that suspends basal if you start to go low. So any adjustments to what you've been talking about if you're on one of those types
I mean,
of pumps?
fingers crossed, those systems will do a better job at preventing more of the lows. But I personally would still use the match system. So for example, if let's say I was using an APS system now, Control IQ or a 780G, and let's just pretend that this said 5.5 with a double arrow down. There is no way in the world that a suspension of insulin is going to stop me going from low in the next 10 minutes. It just ain't happening. So the value of having one of these systems is you should very rarely see a 5.5 with a double arrow down. But if you see a 5.5 with a double arrow down, you've probably over bolused massively. And the only way of preventing that is by having some fast acting glucose. So you could still use that match algorithm, because in reality, you should very, very rarely be between 4 and 6 with straight arrows down if the system's working effectively. If you are like that, you've probably over bolused or done loads of exercise that you haven't compensated for. So I'd say you could probably still use it, but what you might want to do is the percentages of your hypo treatment it suggests is just scale them back a little bit, because it will have potentially suspended some of the insulin. And again, you know your diabetes, you will see the results, you will see what happens, and you'll be able to tailor it to yourselves.
Okay, and a question just coming about different types of insulin. So I guess you'll probably like say the same in terms of trial and error and
yeah, I mean, I use
Fiasp. If you're moved to Fiasp or something like that.
I use Fiasp, but it still stands that, you know, the beauty of Fiasp, it gets working in about 5 minutes quicker. That's all it does. It's about 5 minutes quicker in starting working. Obviously, the companies would love to tell you it's this amazing thing that you can give at eating or after eating, but that's just not the truth. The research doesn't show that. You still need to give it pre-bolus by 15 minutes at least. So those things kind of still stand realistically until they can make insulins work a lot faster. You know, that those kind of algorithms will still be pretty close to the mark.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, John. So many things. If you're like me, you will remember 2 or 3 of them, but you'll need to go to the Glucose Never Lies to get all kind of 323 of them. So if you Google Glucose Never Lies, it takes you straight to John's blog. I've done it before myself. And there's all sorts of, you know, the graphs are there, the diagrams are there, as well as some more of the explanation. So John, thanks ever so much again for helping us all, and everybody for your participation. There are kids sessions coming up next at 10:15, and then the next set of adult sessions are at 11 o'clock. So maybe see you all then. Thanks a lot, everybody.